The morning Vivienne Calloway was escorted out of the Meridian Capital Group building, the sky over downtown Boston was the color of old pewter. 41 years old, sharply dressed in a charcoal blazer she could no longer afford, she carried a single cardboard box and wore the practiced calm of someone who had spent 2 decades making decisions worth millions of dollars. But as she stepped through the revolving glass door for the last time, her hands were trembling. 6 months earlier, Vivienne had been the chief financial officer of one of New England's most respected investment firms. Her name appeared in Forbes profiles and on speaking panels at Harvard Business School. She drove a black Audi, lived in a Beacon Hill apartment with a view of the Charles River, and kept a standing reservation at Oleana on Friday evenings. She had built all of it from scratch, pulling herself out of a modest upbringing in rural Maine with nothing but ambition and a relentless work ethic. Then the Dalton Fund collapsed. It wasn't entirely her fault. Most of it wasn't, actually. But in the world of high finance, proximity to disaster is its own kind of guilt. The SEC investigation began in March. By April, Meridian had placed her on indefinite leave. By June, she had been asked, formally but firmly, not to return. Her legal fees consumed her savings. The apartment she sublet to cover costs. The Audi went back to the dealership. 3 months later, she was living out of 2 suitcases in a friend's spare room in Cambridge, refreshing her email every 20 minutes hoping for a response to one of the 87 job applications she had sent. None came. She had been erased from her own life with a surgical precision that still stunned her. The colleagues who once sought her advice now ignored her calls. Her name, when it appeared online, appeared only in the context of the investigation. She stopped reading the articles after the 3rd one described her as a central figure in the collapse. She wasn't a central figure. She was a woman who had trusted the wrong partner and signed one too many documents without reading the footnotes. It was on a Tuesday in late October during one of those long afternoons when the light comes through the windows at the wrong angle and everything looks slightly worse than it is, that Vivienne received a letter from a law office in Gloucester. She almost didn't open it. She had developed a reflexive dread of official correspondence, but the return address caught her eye: Hargrove and Stills, Estate and Probate Law, and the name in the subject line stopped her completely. The letter informed her that her great-grandfather, Edmund Rowe, had died at the age of 93, and that, according to his estate, she was the sole beneficiary of a property located on Carrow Island, off the coast of Maine. The property was described simply as a decommissioned lighthouse structure and surrounding land, approximately 1.4 acres. Vivienne sat with the letter for a long time. She had never met Edmund Rowe. She had barely heard his name, once or twice in overheard conversations between her grandmother and her mother, always spoken in a way that suggested the subject was closed. She hadn't even known he was still alive. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have much of anything. But 3 days later, she packed her 2 suitcases into a rental car and drove north toward a coastline she had not seen in 15 years, toward an island she had never visited, and toward a lighthouse she didn't yet know would change everything. Carrow Island was a 12-minute ferry ride from the town of Harwick, a fishing village of about 900 people, where the main street smelled of salt air and fried clams and old rope. The island itself was barely half a mile long, inhabited only during summer by a handful of seasonal residents, and by November, it was almost entirely deserted. The ferry captain, a heavyset man named Gill, who wore the same orange vest every day regardless of the weather, looked at Vivienne's luggage with undisguised curiosity. "You're the one taking over the Rowe property?" he asked, as they pulled away from the dock. "I inherited it," she said carefully, as if the distinction mattered. Gill nodded slowly. "Edmund Rowe, interesting man, kept to himself mostly. Last 5 years he wasn't well enough to come out to the island, but before that he'd spend every summer there, even when the lighthouse had been dark for 30 years. He paused. "You family?" "Apparently." The lighthouse appeared as they rounded the eastern edge of the island, a white tower, perhaps 80 feet tall, with a black iron railing around the lamproom at the top. From a distance, it looked almost dignified. Up close, as Vivienne discovered when she dragged her suitcases up the gravel path from the small dock, it told a different story. The exterior paint was peeling in long, curling strips. The door at the base was warped in its frame and required her full weight to open. The attached keeper's cottage, a low 2-room structure built from the same pale granite as the tower, had a cracked window pane stuffed with newspaper and a roof that had developed over the years, a subtle but unmistakable sag. Inside the cottage, The smell was of damp wood and old fires. There was a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed with a wool blanket that had seen better decades, a kitchen table with 4 mismatched chairs, and shelves of canned goods left by Edmund on his last visit. Their labels faded, and in some cases entirely illegible. A generator in a shed out back provided intermittent electricity. The water came from a cistern fed by rainfall. Vivienne stood in the center of the cottage and took a long, measured breath. In Boston, she had managed a department of 37 people. She had negotiated a derivatives contract on a yacht in Monaco. She had once calmed a board of directors during a 4-hour crisis call without letting her voice waver. She sat down on the edge of the bed and cried for approximately 8 minutes. Then she stopped because there was no point in continuing, and she went to find the fuse box. Over the next 2 weeks, she established a routine. She drove the small skiff she found moored at the dock, learning by trial and error, with a maritime guide she downloaded before losing reliable cell signal, into Harwich 3 times a week for supplies. She patched the cottage window with proper glazing putty she found at the hardware store. She hired a local carpenter named Desmond, a quiet man in his 60s who had done work on the island before, to assess the roof and tell her honestly how bad it was. It was bad, but not unfixable. She began cleaning the lighthouse tower room by room, working her way upward. On the 3rd floor landing, behind a rusted door that she had to oil 3 separate times before it would swing open, she found a wooden chest. It was not locked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them almost perfectly, were 7 notebooks, thick, cloth-bound journals filled with dense, careful handwriting in faded blue ink. On the cover of the first in the same handwriting were 2 lines, Edmund Rowe, private record, and below it, a date, June 1959. She didn't read them immediately. For 2 days the notebook sat on the kitchen table while she worked, patching, cleaning, cataloging, and glanced at them sideways the way you look at something you're not quite ready to face. Edmund Rowe was a stranger to her. He was a name in a legal document, a photograph she'd never seen, a branch of family that had been, for reasons no one had ever bothered to explain to her, quietly pruned. On the 3rd night, with rain striking the cottage windows and the generator humming steadily, she sat down at the kitchen table, made a cup of instant coffee and opened the first notebook. Edmund Rowe had become the keeper of Carrow Light in the spring of 1957, at the age of 27, after a decade at sea as a merchant mariner. He wrote with the careful precision of someone who had learned that words, once committed to paper, carry weight. The early journals documented his daily routines, the maintenance of the lamp mechanism, the weather, the boats he watched pass, but woven through the practical observations were passages of striking introspection. He was a man who had been alone long enough to become genuinely interesting company to himself. By the 2nd notebook, Vivienne had begun to understand why the family had stopped talking about him. In 1961, Edmund had been engaged to a woman named Dorothea, Vivienne's great-grandmother on her mother's side. The engagement, according to Edmund's account, had been warm and genuine. But Dorothea's family, the Gallons, had money and standing in Gloucester society, and they had decided, with the particular cruelty that wealth sometimes permits, that a lighthouse keeper on a remote island was not an appropriate match. The engagement was broken. Dorothea was told through intermediaries that Edmund had chosen to end it himself. She married a banker named Harold Calloway the following year. It was the first of what Edmund called, without self-pity, the arranged erasures. They removed me from the story, he wrote in November 1962, as one removes a character from a novel whose presence complicates the plot. I do not blame Dorothea. She was told a lie and believed it, as one does when the lie is more convenient than the truth. I blame only the architecture of the arrangement, the quiet, confident assumption that some lives are worth less than others, and that the people who live them can be relocated without loss. What followed across the remaining 5 journals was not a bitter account, but something far more surprising, a life of deliberate, dignified construction. Edmund had stayed on the island. He had tended the light. He had read voraciously, corresponded with scholars and sailors, and one remarkable ornithologist named Dr. Patience Vale, with whom he maintained a 40-year friendship entirely by letter. He had documented the birds of Carrow Island with meticulous care. He had, in the journal from 1978, expressed a hope that one day someone in the family would find their way to the lighthouse, not to mourn what was lost, he wrote, but to understand that what is built in isolation is not lesser for its solitude. Near the end of the 6th journal, dated 2003, Vivienne found her own name. I have been told, through Dorothea's granddaughter Patricia, who has been kind enough to write to me over these last years, that there is a young woman named Vivienne in the family who is sharp and stubborn and does not accept easy answers. I do not know if she will ever come here. I have left instructions with my attorneys to ensure that if I precede her into silence, the lighthouse will find its way to her. I hope she will not be too proud to receive it. Pride is, of all the human defenses, the most expensive and the least effective. Vivienne read that passage 3 times. Then she closed the notebook and sat for a while listening to the rain. She thought about her mother, Patricia, who had died 4 years ago and had never mentioned Edmund by name in her presence. She thought about the letters her mother must have sent, quietly, without fanfare, to a man on an island, keeping a thread alive that the rest of the family had assumed was severed. She thought about how many arrangements had been made on her behalf, by people she would never meet, out of a kind of love that does not announce itself. She opened the 7th journal. It was dated 2019, the year Edmund had become too ill to return to the island. The last entry read, "The light has been dark for 30 years. Someone should turn it on again." Vivienne read it twice. Then she made another cup of coffee, took out her laptop, and began researching what it would take to restore a decommissioned lighthouse to operational status. It took 8 months. It took 8 months, and the last of what she made from selling the Beacon Hill furniture she had put into storage, and a small business grant from the Maine Office of Tourism that she applied for 3 times before it was approved, and the labor of Desmond the carpenter, a plumber named Ruthie who came over from the mainland twice a month, and an electrician from Harwick named Cal, who charged half his normal rate because, as he told her plainly, restoring a lighthouse is the kind of thing a man can tell his grandchildren about. Vivienne had expected to feel like a fraud, a disgraced CFO playing at a romantic project she had no business undertaking, but something happened in those 8 months that she had not anticipated. She learned things, real things with weight and texture. She learned the difference between structural rot and surface deterioration. She learned how to reglaze a sash window, how to repoint stone mortar, how to operate a generator with the calm competence of someone who can't afford to panic when it fails at 11 at night in February. She learned the names of the birds that Edmund had catalogued, the black guillemots, the razorbills, the eiders, and began keeping her own notes in a notebook she bought in Harwick, in handwriting that, she realized with a small shock one afternoon, looked remarkably like his. She also learned the island's history in a way you can only learn a place by wintering in it. The particular quality of silence in a snowstorm, the way the fog comes in from the northeast and erases the mainland entirely, the feeling of being genuinely alone in a way that is not frightening, but clarifying. There were days she could go 48 hours without speaking to another person, and she discovered that she was, underneath the conference calls and the quarterly reports and the performance reviews, a person who was actually comfortable with silence. She had just never had enough of it to find out. She published Edmund's bird catalogs on a website she built herself, crediting him as the author. Within 3 months, she had received emails from 14 ornithologists, 2 universities, and 1 documentary filmmaker based in Nova Scotia, who wanted to come to the island in spring. She framed one of Edmund's original observation sheets, a hand-drawn map of nesting sites on the eastern shore dated 1974, and hung it above the kitchen table. The lighthouse restoration was formally completed on the 14th of June, almost exactly 8 months after she had first walked through the warped door at its base. The lamp mechanism, a modern LED array, since the original Fresnel lens had been removed decades ago, was installed by a Coast Guard contractor who arrived by helicopter and shook her hand afterward with what she recognized as genuine respect. The light, when it came on that evening, was visible from Harwick. Gil, the ferry captain, texted her a photograph he had taken from the dock, a white tower against a darkening sky, its beams sweeping out across the water in slow, steady rotations. She stood at the top of the tower and watched it move. She was not the same person who had been escorted out of Meridian Capital Group with a cardboard box. She understood that. The question of whether that person had been worth preserving was one she had stopped asking around February, when she was trying to reseal the cistern lid in the middle of a nor'easter, and it had occurred to her, quite suddenly and without drama, that she was no longer interested in the question. She had contacted 3 maritime heritage organizations and been awarded a residency grant that would allow her, over the following year, to host visiting researchers on the island, using the restored cottage as a base for ecological study. She had agreed to write a foreword for an academic paper being published using Edmund's bird data. She had also, and this surprised her more than anything, been approached by a small Boston-based nonprofit focused on financial literacy for women, who had read a brief profile of her in a coastal Maine magazine and asked if she would consider joining their advisory board. She had said yes to all of it, not because it added up to something that resembled her old life. It didn't, not remotely, but because it added up to something. In September, she went back to Edmund's 7th journal and read the last entry one more time. The light has been dark for 30 years. Someone should turn it on again. She took out her own notebook, the one she had been keeping since February, full of bird sightings and maintenance records and occasional thoughts too large to leave unwritten, and on the page after her last entry, she wrote, "Dear Edmund, I turned it on. I'm sorry it took so long. I think I understand now why you stayed." She closed the notebook. Outside, the beam made its slow circuit steady and unhurried, the way a lighthouse is supposed to be. Not urgent, not dramatic, just present. A fixed point in the dark that says, "Here. Something is here. Watch for it." Below, in the cottage that smelled now of fresh paint and wood oil and coffee, the 7 journals sat on the shelf where she had placed them, beside her own. Outside, the birds Edmund had named and counted and cared about for 60 years moved through the salt air above the water, indifferent to all of it, and yet somehow central to all of it, as they had always been. Vivienne climbed down from the lamp room, made dinner, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at nothing in particular, which is often the best way to finally see clearly.